And you'll discover when you get older and you say, damn, Mr. Wilkinson was right. Now that I'm older, I see what he's talking about. Companies miss out on a lot by making the wrong decisions about the wrong things, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe by the time you get my age, they'll be a little wiser.
Don't.
Yeah, I doubt it too.
It's still do the same thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's when I was a youngster, it was the same thing. So it's a fascinating thing that goes from one generation to the next, it seems.
Just fast on.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, let's give folks a little chance. We'll start in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, Makita.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Hello, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night, Makita. I hope you listed.
Night.
Who else said good night? Maria,
Good night.
how are you?
Fine,
night,
thank
dear.
yourself.
Wonderful. I'm fine, fine, fine. Keeping up with you, whippersnappers. Who else? Charles, are you there? Ronaldo.
Good night, sir.
How are you tonight?
All is well, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful. Charles, are you there?
Yes, good evening. Sorry, was having some technical mute issues.
It's okay. Week before last, I had the ultimate, the DPL technique.
Yeah, I was on at that time.
Yeah, so that's fine. We live in a world of madness. Thea, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So we're going to get started. I suppose those of your colleagues who can get to the computers tonight, they'll join us somewhere along the way. But we need to get started because we have quite a few interesting things to talk about further. Let's not forget that your midterm is on which date? Does anybody remember?
February 22nd, I believe.
Wonderful. Is that week after next?
Yeah.
Yes. Please make a note of that. February the 22nd, week after next, will be your midterm exam. Remember, it's simply going to be short answer questions and multiple choice questions. Somebody raised the question about what kind of format it might take. Really, um, you just need to be familiar with the fundamentals. If you are, for example, if you know that the purpose of board committees, that would be a potential question. The different types of board committees, I might say list 3 important board committees, or I might say describe the functions of the following committees: audit, nominations, and so on. And if you can answer questions like that, you should be fine. If you can answer question on the duties and responsibilities of the board, what is independence on the board, who is an INED, the usual stuff you need to know to put in your back pocket when you're thinking around board meetings and around senior management people. Okay. If I ask you to describe 3 components of the board composition, you should know I'm talking about size and makeup and characteristics and qualifications and experience, things like that. Okay, so once you learn the basic stuff, you should be fine. There will be no surprises. I won't ask any questions from the fine print and all that stuff. Okay. Any questions about, any other questions about or concerns about the exam? Anyone?
Yes, Mr. Wilkinson. I mean,
Go ahead.
it's a virtual class. It's a virtual class. So how will we sit the exam?
Well, Miguel and company, we have an online examination process. He is going to hook you up to a special examination link. The question will be sent to you virtually and be in front of you. There'll be quote unquote virtual answer sheets at the bottom where you just type in on a Word document your responses. And then when you're done, you send it by email to Miguel. Okay. The other part of it is, like any other examination, once we begin, you have to do a couple of things. You will have to turn on your video so I can see you. And if you have to make a quick run or the house is on fire or something, you can say so and be off and come back to the fire as soon as you can. But basically, that's how it's going to work. Okay, it'll be a purely virtual exam. I'll be seeing you as if I was in the classroom. You answer your questions in the Word document beneath the questions. And then when you're done, you hit the submit button and you'll be fine. Any other questions on
About how many questions will be given?
Well, on average, between 10 and 15 short answer questions, and up to about 10 or 15 definitions, and about between 15 and 20 short answer questions.
Is there any mock? You know, little template mock, like a little practice run? No way.
Not really.
How much time do we have for this exam?
The exam
3 hours.
Yeah, you have the full class time. I'm not going to stress you with time because it's more important to me that you can put the information down the best that you can. That's kind of my concern at this point. Okay, so you will have the full class time, which is 3 hours. Those of you who don't need it, as soon as you're done, read it over, satisfied, don't change any correct answers, you may submit. Okay? Some people might be finished in 1 hour, some might need the full 3 hours. Either way, you won't have that time constraint. I want you to have all the time that the class requires for you to respond. Any other questions? If you think of anything, remember you can just jump in, because this is kind of a jump-in session. You can jump in anytime. Okay? If you think of something. Okay, I see Indira is here. Are you there, Indira? Indira.
I'm here. I was the one who asked the questions about the time.
Oh, that was you, Indira.
Yes, that was me.
Man, you sounded about 17 and a half. I wouldn't have thought.
Wow. Okay, you're making my evening right now.
Well, welcome aboard. And who else I Paulette, I saw you somewhere.
Hi, I'm here.
Wonderful. Welcome back on the Titanic.
I'm sorry I wasn't here for the last couple of classes, guys.
That's okay.
Got really busy.
Yes.
Thank you for
Things
your
are
call
beginning
earlier
to get
today.
interesting.
Yes.
Still tough for some people, but a little more interesting for others. And that's a good thing. At least there's signs of something. All right, so welcome aboard. Any other questions before we move in? Remember, your midterm exam is week after next. Please don't wait until 3 days to begin preparing. Just start reading, making notes, like what are the different types of board duties? What is senior management's responsibility? What is the primary responsibilities of the board? What kinds of committees are there? What do they do? What are their jobs? See, so you start preparing early by making your notes or reading or studying, however you do it. Once you understand the information, once you basically have the information, you shouldn't have any issues. Be no trick questions. Okay, so there you go. All right. Who was the reader last week? Was it in?
I read Indira read last week.
Indira, okay.
Yes.
So I wouldn't pick on Indira yet. Again, I need to find.
I read last week as well.
Who said that?
Marquita.
Marquita. In other words, don't pick me either.
I wasn't the yes.
So did I.
Kiss my foot. So it's guys' night out then. Let's see if we can find a guy in this group.
I read last week as well. I think it's Charles' time, Mr. Wilkinson.
Charles, no wonder Charles was so quiet. Charles.
I'm available to read.
Who's available? Paulette?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
tell me where I'm reading.
Yeah, stick a pin. I'll tell you very shortly when you can begin, Paulette. Indira, did you stop at, I think we did all that independence stuff, definition of independence.
I was the last person that read.
Who?
Maria.
Oh, Maria. Where did you stop, Maria? Do you remember?
Yeah, 1 second.
I think it's by financial statements.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
That was the discussion. I know we talked about board independence.
Yeah, but we had passed.
I know we went past it. Board leadership, we talked about it. Board committee structure, the audit committee. Was it around there?
I think, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll start at the audit committee because we began our discussion on board committees, and the audit committee is the first one up.
I think it was financial statements, though. I think I read the overboarding, selecting the outside auditor.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we had financial statements, the paragraph beginning there.
Financial statements.
I'm sorry, guys. I have 6 attachments. And there's corporate governance, the G20 OECD principles, central bank Bahamas, ethics and compliance space, financial literacy for board members. Which one am I reading from?
Guiding principles. Guiding principles. But I think that's not in the email. I think you might be looking at the email Miguel sent. You have to look at the email that Mr. Wilkinson sent, where there's a document called Guiding Principles.
Okay.
There should be 2 documents in that email.
All right.
While she's looking, does anybody remember what we meant by overboarding? What do we mean by overboarding? Anybody? Test question? Overboarding?
Yeah, when you have persons that sit on various, I guess, boards of other organizations, which may, I guess, limit or impact their, I guess, level of service on more important boards, or some boards rather than others, something like that.
Indeed, they can become too tied up in too many board issues. It can potentially create conflict of interest issues. In addition to the fact that the efficiency and effective levels of a person who's tied up in too many areas can be significantly reduced. It's like having like two. It's like having like 3 girlfriends or something. Okay? That could really be a problem after a while.
Yeah, that's a lot of
I
effort.
wouldn't suggest it even on my enemies. Okay, so that would be, this is where the expression "don't go overboard" came from. Ever heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we say don't go overboard. It means don't take on more than you can handle, because at the end of the day, you are likely going to suffer, and if your luck is really bad, potentially drown. Okay, the same thing happens with board members. If you're sitting on too many boards, you're going to get tangled up somewhere. And then you're going to have to start questioning your energy, your efficiency, your effectiveness, and in some cases, your allegiance. Mm. And we all thought board meetings were just about eating caviars and collecting fees. Far from it. Some people have a big party at board meetings, but they're not supposed to be parties.
I know in credit union movement, one of the disqualifications for being on the board is if you are a board member on one of the other credit unions. So you can only, yeah.
Thank you very much for saying that. That is what we call a conflict of interest. It should never, never, ever, never, ever happen in the case of credit unions. And the same thing in case of certain organizations. If you are sitting on the board of one company that's in the same industry as another company, and the board of another company, they're all in the same industry, they're competitors, and all this kind of stuff, that is a big problem. It should not happen, which is why board members have to be properly screened. You can't just bring in your friend or the guy you grew up with or the girl you know well, your church member, the deaconess. You can't just do that because of those relationships, because they have, just as she said, potential conflict of interest issues. And sometimes these conflicts are not discovered until after, because when we bring in people we know, we're connected to, we like, whatever the case might be, we don't normally do the proper screening. And sometimes we don't discover the conflict until well into the war. Some non-academic issues. It's not in our notes, but that's what it means. Okay, that's part of the overboarding process. Interestingly enough, in the academic notes, it doesn't say overboarding means one credit union board member should not sit on. It doesn't say that, but just show us how she said it. That's what it means, and that's only one of what it means. Okay, there are a lot of other overboarding issues. So as you go forward, try not to jump overboard.
I found the guiding principles.
Okay, go down to page 14 or so, financial statements.
Okay.
We're talking about the audit committee down to the financial statements. We said that the audit committee should pick people with financial acumen, meaning that you should have some kind of financial background. If you're not an expert, you don't have to be, at least one person should be an expert on the audit committee, but the others do not have to be experts, but they sure as hell should have some idea of financial information. Okay?
Right.
If the person is only a born-again Christian and that's all they know, they probably should sit on the Holy Ghost committee and the board, but not the finance committee. See my point? Like that. All right, so we're down now to, by the way, what is the purpose of the audit committee selecting the appropriate outside auditor? Why is that so critical in governance?
Well, you definitely need someone who is independent or does not have any kind of relationship with the company.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Okay, well put. It's a big problem. Even now, finding an audit firm who's independent, because in recent years, we have discovered that some of our audit firms are not acting independently. And so now boards cannot just go out and pick any audit firm. It now has to scan horizon and look at the history of certain audit firms and ask themselves, do these guys have a history of not being independent? Can they be persuaded? Now, some boards don't mind getting an audit firm that can be persuaded. They want one of them, even though that's not good governance. But ideally, a board and its committee that is seeking an independent auditor ought to be looking for true independence. It saves everybody, including the external auditor, a lot of pain and potential suffering and fines and reputational issues and so on. Okay? All right. So now, Paulette, you're up. Financial statements as part of the audit committee work.
Okay. Financial statements. The committee should discuss significant issues relating to the company's financial statements with management and the outside auditor and reviewing earnings press releases before they are issued. The committee should understand the company's critical accounting policies and why they were chosen, what key judgments and estimates management made in preparing the financial statements, and how they affect the reporting financial results, the reported financial results. The committee should be satisfied that the financial statements and other disclosures prepared by management present the company's financial condition and results in operations accurately and are understandable.
Now, let me say something before you go on, Paulette, about this financial statement thing. These principles and policies that govern financial statements are absolutely critical to the financial reporting process. Many firms hide important information under language and principles and programs within financial statements. They fail to disclose, or when they do disclose, they disclose stuff that are questionable or nobody understands, or that are downright incorrect. Which is why when auditors come in, they are supposed to be looking at these financial statements with jaundiced eyes. And the committee needs to be looking at auditing firms that will look at them with jaundiced eyes so that they can see and determine if all the information that is being presented in those financial statements and all the disclosures, because a lot of stuff is not in numbers. A lot of stuff on a financial statement is hidden in writing that nobody understands a bloody thing. Sometimes the auditors are not even clear, God forbid. And I'm being a little facetious because they usually do know when they are reporting this stuff inappropriately. Okay? The point is, the management does not always report the disclosures properly or clearly. The auditing firms are expected to recognize these things, make the necessary adjustments where appropriate, so that the financial statements can truly reflect generally accepted accounting and auditing principles. All right, so that is very key, which is why, for example, even in small businesses, I have done a few small business consulting jobs, which people don't like to pay a couple of bucks for because they don't understand how important it is. Even if you have an accountant in your company who is seasoned or experienced or CPA, ACCA, CA, or any other A, that's okay. Nobody's questioning their academic capability. The reason why somebody should come in from the outside, and I tell small businesses this in particular, see, large companies and banks and financial institutions and manufacturing firms, they can take the hit in the gazillions of dollars when something goes wrong. But a lot of small companies suffer and lose significant amounts of money because, first of all, they cannot afford and should not be asked to afford an expensive external auditor, but they certainly should have somebody who understands what to look for to come in for a day or 2 or 3 or a week or whatever and look at stuff independently. Somebody knows nobody in the company and say, you know what, that's okay, or how about this or that or that or that or that. And so you leave management with a report that some things need to be fixed, and if you don't fix them, here's what's going to happen. The few $100 you're going to pay to do that is nothing compared to the pain and suffering, not to mention the internal control weaknesses and all the other areas that can lead to fraud, theft, and God knows what else and the management knows really nothing about it. They think they know, because people who own small and medium-sized firms think they know everything about everything, but they don't, and they'll be surprised how much they don't know. Okay? So I always encourage them, just like large firms, get somebody to come in, look at your thing, see if it's going the way it should go. When you leave independent. You don't see them until next year, or whatever the case might be, or 6 months, or however you want to do it. But it's a good thing to do from time to time to give you the comfort without having to take on a major audit bill. Okay, keep going. Hold on.
Yeah. Well, I've had a little experience where we had to hire a business consultant who, she's really good.
It really does help.
And it really does. And the thing is, the principal initially, like, I had to really sell her, like, no, she's regulatory, she's business, she's accounting, she's all of that, right?
Right.
But when the lawyer found out that the older lawyer found out that I had hired her, man, she went berserk. And she really made it very difficult for myself and the consultant.
Right.
Well, we eventually got rid of the lawyer, and then we got a new lawyer. And then what we found out was important filings that needed to be done with the Securities Commission wasn't done. Um, Stuff from when the investor got on the island, that what is called the BIA,
Sure.
Bahamas investor. They were supposed to apply for him to get approval. They didn't get that. So I mean, we done gone on to Securities Commission. We done this man done spend must see about $1 million to $1.5 million with this lawyer.
Which means that there's some serious governance issues going on here.
Serious governance issues, man.
And it's amazing that these guys are allowed to get away with it to the extent that they do before corrective measures are actually taken.
Yeah.
It's truly amazing how much they can get away with, quote unquote, in the world of governance before something is actually done. And oftentimes it costs people and companies and entities and individuals tons of money that they could be using in other productive areas. Yeah, absolutely.
And
And it's not over.
listen, what we eventually got rid of that lawyer. Well, that lawyer got rid of herself.
Yes.
Themselves, let me put it that way. And um, the the new lawyers, when they came in and they started asking for certain documents or whatever, and it was like, I never saw that document. We did ask for a number of documents, but we didn't get, you know,
From the
and
old lawyer.
from the old lawyer. So of
Right.
course, the new lawyer was great. He was able to, you know, to deal with them. But boy,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and part of it too was the investor was very okay. So the history is he's Asian, and they have that thing of being very secretive, and
Nothing has changed, definitely.
yeah, being
Sure.
secretive, and
They've been secretive from God created Asians 5,000 plus years ago.
okay, well, there you go. And then they believe white is better, and so it was like, but hold on a second, but these white people screwing you. I mean,
Always,
I said they're screwing you, buddy.
always.
You don't need them. You're brilliant. You already got this. Get rid of them.
That's right.
And I mean, eventually he did, but it was just like, why did you doubt that you could do it?
Because it is the preconceived notion are in and around the world about all of these things, unfortunately. As a matter of fact, most of the problems that we have are oftentimes preconceived. Most of the things that cost us money, time, and circumstance are preconceived based on these notions. And a lot of times people have to learn the hard way.
Hard way. Well,
Just like the thing about committees. People think that their friend and relations and affiliations and from the something cap or something in college or something are the best people for them until they discover sometime later that they're not necessarily the best people for them.
yeah,
All
yeah,
right, the best people for them are the people who you don't know,
yeah,
who may
yeah.
not be white or green or Martian or whatever the case might be, whatever the hell these people do. You just have to look at people in the context that you should and then move accordingly. So yeah, okay, keep going. Internal controls.
I'm sorry about holding up the class. Okay, internal controls. The committee oversees the company's system of internal controls over financial reporting and its disclosure controls and procedures, including the processes for producing the certifications required of the CEO and principal financial officer. The committee periodically reviews with both the internal and outside auditors, as well as with management, the procedures for maintaining and evaluating the effectiveness of these systems. The committee should be promptly notified of any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in internal controls and kept informed about the steps and timetable for correcting them.
Keep going.
Risk assessment and management. Many audit committees have at least some responsibility for risk assessment and management due to stock market rules. However, the audit committee should not be the sole body responsible for risk oversight, and the board may decide to allocate some aspects of risk oversight to other committees or to the board as a whole, depending on the company's industry and other factors. A company's risk oversight structure should provide the full board with the information it needs to understand all of the company's major risks, their relationship to the company's strategy, and how these risks are being addressed. Committees with risk-related responsibilities should report regularly to the full board on the risks they oversee and brief the audit committee in cases where the audit committee retains some risk oversight responsibility. Continue?
Yeah, keep going.
Compliance. Unless the full board or one or more other committees do so, the audit committee should oversee the company's compliance program, including the company's code of conduct. The committee should establish procedures for handling compliance concerns related to potential violations of law or the company's code of conduct, including concerns relating to accounting, internal accounting controls, auditing, and securities law issues. Internal audit. The committee oversees the company's internal audit function and ensures that the internal audit staff has adequate resources and support to carry out its role. The committee reviews the scope of the internal audit plan, significant findings by the internal audit staff, and management response, and the appointment and replacement of the senior internal auditing executive, and assesses the performance and effectiveness of the internal audit function annually.
Okay, stick a pin for one moment. Again, we spend a lot of time talking about the external auditors and their importance to the firm and the committee's responsibility for choosing the appropriate audit firms to come in. Let's not forget the internal audit function. Sometimes the internal audit function is equally as critical as the external audit function. Remember, external auditors come in primarily to check the veracity of financial statement reporting. Generally, nothing else. So in terms of day-to-day operations, cash operations on a daily basis, controls over assets, liquid and otherwise, maintenance of assets, liquid and otherwise, HR resources, and all these kinds of other operational issues that can impact the firm from day to day. Those things are looked at by the internal auditors, which means that when the board and its committee gets a report from its internal audit department, they should not treat it as if it's just an interruption to their agenda, because sometimes we have a bias towards the external auditor. We think that they're the gods of it all, and whatever the internal auditors do is a byproduct. Unfortunately, a lot of firms have discovered that when they ignore the reports of internal auditors, they ignore it, especially nowadays, to their peril. Again, the external auditors come in to look at financial statements, balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements, and the reporting disclosures, and to determine whether or not generally accepted accounting principles have been applied appropriately to the statements. It generally is not looking at other stuff. If it comes across other stuff in its review of the financial statements, then the auditor has responsibility to report to management its findings. But as far as the day-to-day operations, that is primarily reviewed and checked by internal audit, which means that when those audit reports come in, just like compliance reports, when they go to the board, the audit committee's job is to make sure that every concern that is put forth by internal audit is investigated, checked, and resolved. Otherwise, somebody is going to regret it sooner or later. But I've seen many boards who underscore the importance of their own internal audit function because they see it as just as any other administrative function within the firm. And yes, while it is administrative in nature, its level of importance is significant. Right? And any board and committee worth its salt would do well to consider the work of its internal audit. All right, keep going on that.
Okay. Nominating Corporate Governance Committee. Director Qualifications. The committee should establish and recommend to the board for approval criteria for board membership, excuse me, and periodically review and recommend changes to the criteria. The committee should review annually the composition of the board, including an assessment of the mix of the director's skills and experience, an evaluation of whether the board as a whole has the necessary tools to effectively perform its oversight function in a productive collegial fashion, and an identification of qualifications and attributes that may be valuable in the future based on, among other things, the current director's skill sets, the company's strategic plan, and anticipated director exists.
Okay, so again, what are the qualifications for the directors? Most of us don't hear much about the qualifications. We just have somebody with a great business background or some other great background, some Mary, Sir Henry, great CPA, great something. And we say, okay, they're qualified for the job, and they might be. But that doesn't mean that the stipulations for our director qualifications should not be written down. There should be a clear path to the fundamental qualifications for directors so that the board can have a cross section of the appropriate persons, not only on the board, but who are available to sit on board committees. Okay? Because usually board committees come out of where? The board. So if you have a board that's filled with athletes who ran the Olympics in 1983, I mean, I'm not saying they can't run the company. I'm just saying that that's not good. And the committee is going to be made up of a group of them as well. And so who's going to do the financial evaluation and all the other things that need to be done in the various committees? Okay? So we have to be mindful of the board's qualifications to make sure that all persons who are sitting are appropriately qualified and cross-sectional in terms of who you have available to do your committee work and to make final decisions at the board level. Okay, succession planning.
Okay, succession planning. The committee, together with the board, should actively conduct succession planning for the board of directors. The committee should proactively identify director candidates by canvassing a variety of sources with potential candidates and retaining such firms. Shareholders invested in the long-term success of the company should have a meaningful opportunity to nominate directors and to recommend director candidates for nomination by the committee, which may include proxy access if shareholder support is broad-based, and the board concludes this access is in the best interest of the company and its shareholders. Although the CEO meeting with potential board candidates is appropriate, the final responsibility for selecting director nominees should rest with the Nominating Corporate Governance Committee and the board.
Yes, keep going.
Background and experience. In connection with renomination of a current director. See, I'm always thinking about money.
No, bro, I don't have any problem.
I'm an investment advisor. That's what I do.
Yes, so all you can see is remuneration there.
That's all I saw.
By all means, okay, it has to be the money one. Keep going.
My apologies. In connection with renomination of a current director, the Nominating Corporate Governance Committee should review the director's background, perspective, skills, and experience. Assess the director's contributions to the board. Consider the director's tenure, and evaluate the director's continued value to the company in light of current and future needs. Some boards may undertake these steps as part of the annual nomination process, while others may use a director evaluation process. Continue.
Mm-hmm.
Independence.
That word again. So it doesn't matter where we go. Yeah, whether you're on the board, on the committee, it's in church boards, credit union board, wherever it is, we still need to have a certain amount of independence, because that is so critical and so wanted and so needed. Okay, absolutely. Keep going.
Okay. The Nominating Corporate Governance Committee should ensure that a substantial majority of the directors are independent, both in fact and in appearance. Okay, explain that.
Yeah, in fact and in appearance. In other words, if you are hired to sit on the board or picked for a board committee because the board feels that you are actually independent of the company itself, in other words, you don't have any affiliation to the company, that is in fact, because you in fact don't have any affiliation to that company or entity.
Okay.
The other part of that is not only should you not should you be independent in fact because you don't have any connection to the entity, but also your behavior should exhibit that of independence. Okay? So you can't allow yourself to come in and be driven by whatever carrots, doggone it, are dangled in front of you. You're still expected to be the independent person that you're supposed to be in fact by your very behavior. Okay?
We have a saying in law, justice must not only be done, it must appear as though
it must be saying, yeah, it must appear to be done. Absolutely. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Keep going.
All right. The committee should take the lead in assessing director independence and make recommendations to the board regarding independence determinations. In addition, each director should promptly notify the committee of any change in circumstances that may affect the director's independence, including but not limited to employment change or other factors that could affect director independence.
Of course, because the director might come there working for a non-competitor. 6 months later, they're now working for whom? The company competitor.
Okay, all right.
So we have a problem, Houston. And a lot of times these things happen and directors don't disclose. They try to hide it, especially if it's not so evident in terms of finding out what the connection is all about. See? So even where we have, for example, let's say we have a small investment company and they have a couple of people sitting on the board, and then the person sits on another board somewhere that's competitive, but not necessarily that easily detectable, they may not say anything. So man, 2 salaries, this is great. I know there's a connection here, but if I don't tell, they won't know.
Right.
That should not happen. It should be disclosed, but it doesn't always happen. Folks hide stuff still in the 21st century, they tell me. Okay, keep going.
Tenure limits. The committee should consider whether procedures such as mandatory retirement ages or term limits are appropriate. Other practices, such as a robust director evaluation process, may make this tenure limits unnecessary, but they may still serve as useful tools for ensuring board engagement and maintaining diversity and freshness of thought. Many boards also require that directors who change their primary employment tender their resignation so that the board may consider the desirability of their continued service in light of their changed circumstances.
In other words, some persons actually come up front and say, hey, my circumstances have changed. I'm going to resign, so that you consider whether or not there's any conflict of interest issues. If you're happy that there are none, I'll be happy to come back on the board. Okay?
Okay.
That's what we call proper governance, and certainly great ethics by a particular individual. It unfortunately is not as common as you'd like it to be, but sometimes it happens.
Well, I'm proud to say, Mr. Wilkinson, I think I fall in the category. I sat as chairman of the supervisory committee for the league, which is the apex body of credit unions, and I had a job change. And at the following AGM after job change, I resigned as chairman.
Excellent. You don't see it too often. Let me ask you if you can say, if you can't, it's okay. The position was gratuitous or was a paid position?
It was gratuitous.
Yeah. But it doesn't matter that it's gratuitous, because the point is, even if it's not a paid position, you're still in a position of responsibility where your decisions are going to impact an organization, period. Okay? And so whether it's paid or unpaid has nothing to do with the responsibility to take the action that he took. And that was the appropriate action. But a lot of people will not do that, paid or unpaid. They're going to hang in there, for better or for worse, until you have to sweep them away, kicking and screaming, or whatever the case might be. Yeah, so that was quite the appropriate thing to do, but don't be surprised if you don't see people always stepping up to do that kind of governance thing. Okay, trust me on that. Especially if there's power and money involved, and even if there's not power and money involved, gratuitous positions have a certain amount of influence as well that people don't wish to give up, so they hang in there when in fact they shouldn't. All right, way to go. To you are rare, because most of us are hanging in there, doggone it, until some wind blows us away, or there's a coup like in Myanmar. Get. All right, keep going.
Thank you for setting that example, Mr. Toot.
Indeed. Not easy.
Okay, so where we at? Board leadership. Okay.
Yes.
The committee should conduct an annual evaluation of the board's leadership structure and recommend any changes to the board.
By the way, which committee are we talking about still?
Audit Committee? No.
Is it?
This is the Nomination Corporate Governance Committee.
Yes. Now, the reason why I said that, when you're studying, make sure you guys have your information under the appropriate headings, because sometimes, given the nature of this stuff, you can cross it over and think you're in one committee or one board issue or one responsibility or particular duty, when in fact you're somewhere else. So if you're in board duties, make sure you're in board duties, make sure you're in the right committee and responding to your questions and so on. Okay? So be careful there. I've seen students kind of cross over a little bit. Okay, keep going.
Okay. Board leadership. The committee should conduct an annual evaluation of the board's leadership structure and recommend any changes to the board. The committee should oversee the succession planning process for the board chair, which should involve consideration of whether to combine or separate the positions of CEO and board chair, and whether events such as the end of the current chair's tenure or the appointment of a new CEO may warrant a change to the board leadership structure.
Let me ask you students something. Based on your experience or otherwise, should the CEO also sit as the chair of the board?
No.
Okay, why not?
Shouldn't.
Why
Thank
not?
you, Lord.
Why shouldn't that happen?
Because it's a conflict and their job descriptions are different.
Yeah.
And sometimes they may differ. The opinion of the CEO may not or should not be the same decision as director. Director should have some type of leeway or leverage to disagree with the CEO for the betterment of the organization.
No question about it. In this case, where the person is the chairman of the board and CEO, that's a clear conflict. That should be avoided wherever possible, and certainly at all costs, because they are two, just as she said, completely different job descriptions. If they are the same person, there's a serious hit to independence. Remember that word?
Yeah.
And it would be extremely difficult for such a person to wear two hats and maintain the independence.
So may I ask this question? So why would this paragraph actually make the recommendation for a possibility of combining the positions?
because unfortunately there are organizations where the chairman is the CEO and vice versa. But that doesn't mean that because it exists, it is ideal or even should exist. Okay?
So but then when we first started reading this, we talk about governance strategies. So wouldn't there be certain governance strategies or procedures that would be in place when you have entities that have the, I guess, the intermingling of responsibilities between the two groups?
Sure, no doubt there would be strategies well written by qualified and astute persons, no doubt. But the truth of the matter is, in reality, when it comes to practice, the strategies that are written are oftentimes incongruent with practice. And so it is felt that, yes, you can have your strategies and try and live up to them to the best of your ability, but just know that in practice, if they are the same, there's going to be a serious hit to independence and certainly put great potential conflict of interest issues. So yes, we can have them, but they are discouraged. Okay, for sure. Now, if you have a small firm, for example, like really small, and somehow it's economical to do that, and there aren't too many conflict of interest issues, and too many people are not going to be hurt, and all this kind of stuff, and that assessment has come up, and the strategy outlines this carefully enough, sure, it's something to consider. But generally speaking, as a firm gets bigger and more diverse, it's not a good idea. Right? And of course, these things have to be determined on a company by company basis based on the nature and type of entity that we're dealing with. Okay? For sure. But on the surface, it is usually not a good idea. Can it be done? Of course. Should it be clearly defined? Of course, in each case. Okay? For example, if people who are related work in the same organization or department, they might say, well, we won't get in each other's way, we swear. To God in heaven, on our mother's grave and stuff like that. We'll say that. We'll write it. We'll sign a document to that effect. But oftentimes in practice, when push comes to shove, stranger things have happened to people who are
related.
Yes, and connected in any way. This is why we try to discourage it. You see it on TV all the time. You see it in practice all the time. People do wrong things, incongruent things, poor governance or whatever. And then you said, but she stole Suzette. And Suzette will say in front of you in tears, I know, but she is my
sister.
And she killed the guy, Suzette. She said, I know, but she is my
mother.
Kiss my foot. Yeah, that's even deeper. But Suzette, everybody knows that your mother is an irresponsible murderer. And she says, I know, but she is still my
family.
Yeah, please let her go. But the next person who ain't related to me, you could mess them up. And therein lies the problem whenever we have this lack of independence, potentially. All right, keep going.
Committee structure. Excuse me, committee structure. Annually, the committee should recommend directors for appointment to board committees and ensure that the committees consist of directors who meet applicable independence and qualification standards. Sorry, I just want to ask a question right there.
Please.
For a board member, what kind of qualifications would they need to have?
For just a board member?
Yeah.
Good question. It depends on the nature and type of entity. They can have any type of qualifications or none, theoretically. But the suggestion here is when you're looking to sit people on a board, you must look at your company, the nature of the company that you're running, and then look at the background, experience, and qualifications of the individual to see how they can best fit on your board in terms of moving it forward. So those qualifications would vary depending on the objectives of the company and its goals going forward. Okay? So for example, if you have a company that, let's say it's a charity, Some people might say, well, you only need honest people, and in charity, they don't need to be qualified in anything, just honest, because it's a charity. Well, we know that charities are not just things that are happening out of the goodness of people's hearts. We know that charities are sued, so you need legal counsel. We know that charities have a lot of money coming into them for one reason or another, so you need financial board members with financial background. We know that charities are used for money laundering and terrorist financing. So we need compliance and so on. So again, these strategies are obviously going to be based on the nature and type of company and their risk-related issues, by all means. That's how we determine the qualifications for our board. And how we go about doing this is going to determine really how effective our boards will be. A lot of times people don't consider these academic issues in terms of establishing a board. A lot of boards are established purely on relationships. I know you, we went to the same church. We have the white, the other thing, Kappa thing, sorority thing, fraternity thing, or any other thing like that. And so it may not necessarily be based on the real structured qualifications and experience of an individual, even though some of them might have these things by default. That is certainly not always the primary criteria for folks selecting persons to sit on their boards. Okay? So it's a very good and complex question still. Okay? All right, keep going.
Okay, so committee structure. Okay, board oversight. The committee should oversee the effective functioning of the board, including the board's policies relating to meeting agendas and schedules and the company's processes for providing information to the board, both in connection with and outside of meetings, with input from the lead director or independent chair.
Why do you think the nomination committee doesn't mess with that? Like checking to make sure the meeting stuff come by, everything's accounted for, goes into the file. Why would they be in that stuff? Shouldn't that be automatic? Like, shouldn't people be honest enough to put the thing in the thing?
Excuse me, Mr. Wilkinson, I'm gonna have to ask you to ask someone to read. I just gotta step away for a moment.
No problem. Question to the other students. Why would the nominating committee be caught up in this stuff? Like checking for meetings and agendas, making sure the policies relating to meetings and schedules are dealt appropriately. Why?
I'm interested to hear the answer to that question, because my question would be, in the absence of a corporate governance committee or nomination committee, in the absence of such a structure,
Yes.
who then does this checking? Because I mean, while it may be a common committee, I certainly haven't seen a lot of boards. You know, they may have 2 and 3 other subcommittees, but I haven't seen an actual corporate governance committee or committee that is formed specifically for this. So in the absence of that, who would be responsible for checking, you know, ensuring that the committees consist properly of who they consist of, and checking for the, you know, I would, some of this to me is probably part of the corporate secretary's role in terms of meeting agendas and minutes and all this other stuff. But yeah, who really, in the absence of a corporate governance subcommittee, is doing that checking?
Yeah, great point. Actually,
so sorry.
Go ahead, Ronaldo.
I think that it was that Maria, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess in response on you, I guess Mr. Wilkinson, you could correct me if I'm wrong. I can say for credit unions, I think a lot of that responsibility falls on the supervisory committee, to which the internal auditor reports to. The internal audit doesn't report to the board; they report to the supervisory committee, which supervises internal controls and internal policies of the company, the entity, and the board. So, I mean, reference to using as an example, that's the responsibility of the supervisory committee, to which that's one of the committees I'm a part of.
Yeah, and again, depending on the organization, that group or individual might have a different name. In the case of the credit union, the explanation is a supervisory committee. In another entity, it might be the audit committee. In another entity, it might be the finance committee. In another entity, it might be the secretary of the board. In another entity, it might be, we don't know who the hell is doing that. We're not doing it. Whatever the secretary of the board doesn't do, doesn't get done. So again, the point being made here is that there should be somebody, whatever name we call them, whether it's the supervisor, the audit committee, the secretary of the board, or whatever the case might be, whoever that person is, they should be designated to ensure that these, what appears to be like insignificant kinds of things are properly handled and appropriately dealt with. Because remember, this aspect of it, in terms of the board oversight, only appears insignificant until there's a problem. And then you have to go back to the minutes or find the details of a particular meeting and find out who said what about something that created a multi-million-dollar problem. And then all of a sudden, this function becomes critical as to, wait, I didn't say that. It was Jennifer. And it says, no, it was Maria. Maria says, no, it was Ronaldo talking about supervisory. I know we should have called it audit committee, whatever the case might be. And so all of a sudden you have a dilemma once a problem arises. So we're suggesting here that whatever person name we call it, there should be somebody or some group, whomever they might be, designated who's making sure, like everything else, that these things are being done. For some boards, these are not considered crucial or significant, they're important, but they don't spend a lot of time worrying about them until there's a particular problem connected to that, okay? So yeah, whatever we call it, there should be somebody who's looking at it and making any reports that are necessary to maintain the full governance structure of the board and the organization. Okay?
But I don't think, and again, going back to Maria's point, I don't think we answered I guess your question that you raised, because I'm quite concerned as well. Why would that be the responsibility of a nominating committee and not the auditing committee?
Again, in this particular academic discussion, it falls under the nominating committee. And the reason why it falls under the nominating committee perhaps here is because the nominating committee is generally looking at things like, what is the board leadership all about, the committee structure, and all that kind of stuff, tenure limits and independence again, and these kinds of things, background experiences and checkups on board members. So this kind of stuff would be kind of the tail end of a particular nominating committee in a generally a large firm. But in a smaller firm or different type of entity, does not have to be the nominating committee. It can be somebody or some other group that is designated to do that particular function, by all means. Does not have to be the nominating committee. The point we're making here is there should be somebody or some group who is looking at this, which sometimes appears to be an insignificant area, but certainly an important area. And somebody should be responsible for that. If it isn't a nominating committee, it should be somebody else or some other group, and including perhaps a supervisor of some kind or a corporate secretary, by all means. Okay. So the floor is open on what name we call it, but certainly the function should not be put aside as unimportant. I think that's the point we're making here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I think, just as an input, I think it's quite effective in terms of considerations when you spoke earlier about succession planning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I can't speak generally, but from companies I've been affiliated with, I think sometimes that's absent from when you talk about corporate governance structure and that succession planning.
No question about it. I'm happy you raised it, because where it should be raised, it is not oftentimes raised, and that is in the boardroom. A lot of times, organizations and boards in particular do not give any consideration to succession planning until they are forced to do so by circumstance or by what they call a militant shareholder or some such situation. Somebody got caught up in some.
Or the regulator.
Yeah, central bank scandal, the regulator scandal. The regulator discovers something, and suddenly we need to do something. So yeah, it is not an issue that is oftentimes discussed or brought up unless there is a crisis or some kind of problem, unfortunately. Okay? I do quite a bit, I've done quite a bit of consulting in small and medium-sized businesses in particular, and I've worked in all kinds of offshore banking institutions in my life, including retail financial institutions and all these things. And at every level, all the way up to the board level, where I have raised in one form or another a need to consider succession planning, it was either ignored, they looked at me like I lost my mind, who did I think I was, that was in my portfolio, or whatever, any number of reasons or suggestions as to why it shouldn't be brought up again, that they will deal with it whenever they ready. And so it is not an area that boards spend enough time on. Unfortunately, we always keep waiting for something to go wrong, something unexpected to happen, and then everybody scrambles to think about succession planning. Small businesses and medium-sized businesses in particular, same problem. Talk to a ton of small business persons and medium-sized business persons, like, when you retire or die, if you die unexpectedly, what's going to happen to your company? They cannot answer it directly, or they give me some weird indirect answer. I'm working on it. I'm like, how long have you been working on it? And they start getting irritated. Like, why aren't you the accountant? Why are you asking me about that? The suggestion is they don't really want to deal with it for one reason or another. Okay? And so when the principal person of the company dies, the company dies, instead of continuing on because there's nobody in place, nobody being trained, none of this stuff. It's an unfortunate. Larger companies can survive a lot of that stuff because of their size and resources. Smaller companies and little ones oftentimes do not survive. They die along with the principals. And this is the unfortunate outcome. Okay? So yes, you're right. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of talk about succession planning in the governance process from the top of the large, even at the very highest level and size of organizations, all the way down to the little itsy bitsy mom and pop shop. Even mom and pop do not want to have a discussion. Okay? I talked to a guy 2 weeks ago. He has a thing that he's been running for 25 years. I said, Mr. X, you are now 73. If something happens to you, what's going to happen? Oh, well, I guess you have to close it down. I'm like, why close it down? You have a viable business that's doing well. You've been here for 25 years. Why would you want to close it down? Well, ain't nobody, can't find nobody to do this work. I is the only one who could do it right. And he's convinced of that for some reason. Okay? When in fact, all he has to do is think about that word, succession. He had a young lady there who worked for him for 8 years. I'm his consulting accountant. I said, Mr. X, why don't, she's been here 8 years, she knows how this thing works. Why don't you put in your succession plan so you could go home and just count the money? She's like, well, I don't know. Sometimes she forgets to order paper. In other words, he's finding every excuse to avoid the succession planning issue for whatever reason. And folks don't always tell you the real reason, the real truth about why, along with the other problems. So it continues to be a huge problem. Okay? We still have Bohemians dying without a will. They don't have anything to leave. And then when they die, folks are fighting over the car that's 2005 car, Honda or something, or whatever wealth they have, because they're not thinking about this thing about succession. And believe it or not, a will is a form of succession planning, in case you didn't know. So that's a good point. You're absolutely right. It's a big problem with companies, with individuals, and I suspect only time will improve that situation. You'd think by now in the 21st century, we'd be a little bit better at succession planning. We're a little bit better in some areas, like rich people, they set up a trust and this kind of thing for the gazillions they have, but on average, we don't see it too often, okay? So don't be surprised if you go into an environment you don't have too much of a discussion about succession planning. All right. Paulette, are you still there?
I can continue instead.
Okay, great. Pick it up, Charles. Shareholder engagement.
Corporate governance guidelines. The committee should review annually the company's corporate governance guidelines, if any, and make recommendations about changes in those guidelines to the board.
Indeed.
Shareholder engagement. The committee may oversee the company's and management's shareholder engagement efforts. Periodically review the company's engagement practices and provide to senior management feedback and suggestions for improvement. The committee and the full board should understand the company's effort to communicate with shareholders and receive regular briefings on such communications. Director compensation. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Now it gets interesting.
I don't know whether this is itsy bitsy paragraph, but let's see what they say.
The committee also may oversee the compensation of the board if the compensation committee does not do so, or the two committees may share this responsibility.
All right. Before you go on, the reason why the director compensation is so itsy bitsy on the nomination, because that's not the direct function generally. It's the function of the group that you're going to be talking about next, called the compensation committee. The money committee, what sometimes the nomination committee gets involved because, of course, they're interested in succession planning and making sure that because of poor compensation of board members who are not satisfied and all this kind of stuff, that could affect succession and other strategic planning. So occasionally the nomination committee might get involved. But this next group, the compensation committee, they are on board. Okay, let's go.
Authority. The compensation committee has many responsibilities relating to the company's overall compensation philosophy, structure, policies, and programs. To assist it in performing its duties, the compensation committee must have the authority to obtain advice from independent compensation consultants, counsel, and other advisors. The advisors' independence should be assessed under applicable law and stock market rules, and the compensation committee should feel confident and comfortable that its advisors have the ability to provide the committee with sound advice that is free from any competing interests.
What do we mean by competing interests, anyone?
Any conflict of interest?
Yeah, any kind of conflict of interest that could interfere with because compensation, as you know, is the money side of things, who gets paid what and why. And that's always tricky, which means that people could potentially on the board always be lobbying people on the compensation committee to try and get them to compromise their decision-making process to agree for that somebody get more than somebody else, or whatever the case might be. All right. Competing interest is just a nice name for conflict of interest issues. All right, keep going.
CEO and senior management compensation. A major responsibility of the compensation committee is establishing performance goals and objectives relating to the CEO, measuring performance against those goals and objectives, and determining and approving the compensation of the CEO. The compensation committee also generally approves or recommends for approval the compensation of the rest of the senior management team. Alignment with shareholder interests. Executive compensation should be designed to align the interests of senior management, the company, and its shareholders, and to foster the long-term value creation and success of the company. Compensation should include performance-based elements that reward the achievement of goals tied to the company's strategic plan, but are at risk if such goals are not met. Those performance goals should be clearly explained to the company's shareholders.
Now, folks, let me say this. This discussion about compensation at the board level for board members and CEOs and so on, this is a very tricky and delicate area. What we're talking about here is the academic side of this thing, the kinds of things we ought to be considering, but always bear in mind that what you see in practice will and may oftentimes be incongruent with this academic discussion. However, this academic discussion on compensation governance is the way we ought to go, generally speaking. But what we ought to do and what we actually do are all too often two completely different things. Right? So as you go forward in your professional life, whether as a board member, CEO, management person, or whatever your capacity is, just know that when it comes down to this issue of compensation, compensation even for a teller is a tricky thing in a bank. Like, mother sick, they only give me 2%. I worked hard this year, babe. And stuff like this. So people get mad. So I'm leaving this or whatever. So if compensation at the teller level in the bank or a lower level in an organization, it could sometimes be contentious. Contentious. Imagine at the board and CEO and senior management level. It's a downright war sometimes. Major political stuff going on. Major allies being formed to see who could get who to pay who to what. It's an interesting phenomenon. Okay? So just bear in mind, we're talking about the academic governance requirements. Don't be surprised if what you see in practice does not always conform with this discussion. You may have to be the bold one to try to make it conform. But depending on what organization you're in, good luck. You may not survive it. So a word to the wise is sufficient. Okay? That's why we study this stuff, so we can see what is required. So when we see it not being done, we can decide, are we prepared to get our necks put on the chopping block to fix it? Or are we just going to enjoy the great score you got on your exam and fall in line with the actual practices of the organization we work for?
I'm back, Mr. Wilkinson.
Okay.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. We have a situation with our. Anyway, so I take advice from, my advisors, from people in the company, and then from, my business consultant. And one of my colleagues had noted something with the lawyer, and she said, well, why didn't the lawyer said anything about this thing that one of the senior executives had done in terms of obeying, protocol, going through the CEO and to get stuff done. Right. So then, I thought about it for a moment. I said, the issue becomes this person is getting paid by the investor, even though they need to follow the instructions of the CEO. And of course, they're different people. So now he's caught in the middle, right? And so we have the situations, and I think this happens across the board, where if you're on the board and you're you have some financial obligations and commitments, and you don't really want to rock the boat because you want to continue to be on the board, you want to get paid, and
oh, so yeah, that boat, the rock the boat. That was a song, actually.
rock the boat.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we don't get a lot of governance issues resolved is because nobody wants to rock the boat. Because historically, when you rock the boat, yes, just as you suggested, some people get thrown out the boat.
Exactly.
And if people have mortgages and a big life they enjoy and status and whatever it is that keeps us from rocking the boat, we just rock with the boat. When we know for sure, we ought to be like having somebody walk the plank because some things are not right. But unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And it's a very common problem.
Yeah.
Okay? Which is why a lot of organizations continue to operate the same as usual. They don't do anything significantly different because they continue to do business as usual because nobody wants to rock the boat. Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you for that, Paulette. Tom Jones was pinch hitting for you, so hang in there. He'll finish up.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
But I want you to jump in with this because this stuff you're talking about is the real world, and and so I'm so happy that you guys are jumping in with this real world stuff because it then gives us that very dichotomous view. other than the academic world, we have the real world. And so as you go out there with these two things, you know, one fist over here and one fist over here, then you're in the middle, and you're gonna have to decide how far you're gonna go with this fight towards proper governance. Okay.
Yeah.
My job is to expose you to the academic world uh, and the non-academic world, and for you to come back and say, yeah, I'm seeing this in my work life, so that as you go forward now, you have no excuse in terms of what you ought to do. All you have to do is decide what you will do.
Yeah.
That's how it's put. All right, keep going. Ronaldo, is it?
Charles,
Charles, sorry.
compensation costs and benefits. The Compensation Committee should understand the costs of the compensation packages of senior management and should review and understand the maximum amounts that could become payable under multiple scenarios, such as retirement, termination for cause, termination without cause, resignation for good reason, death, and disability, and the impact of a transaction, such as a merger, divestiture, or acquisition. The committee should ensure that the proper protections are in place that will allow senior management to remain focused on the long-term strategies and business plans of the company, even in the face of potential acquisition, shareholder activism, or unsolicited takeover activity or control bids.
Now,
Stock ownership. Mhm.
sorry, some of those expressions you may not be entirely familiar with, or you might be, but the point is, these are all kinds of things that are happening within the firm that have to be taken into account by the board in terms of its planning processes. And those boards and companies that are affected by any of these issues, or all of them, God forbid, that they are making the necessary plans to deal with them. They're looking at their bank account, the resources, the type of business. Are they still competitive? Their sales and all this kind of stuff, to see where their strengths and weaknesses are. And certainly, these are the kinds of things that should be happening at the board and senior management level as people down the line fight every day to keep the boat afloat. Okay? All right, keep going.
Stock ownership requirements. To further align the interests of directors and senior management with the interests of long-term shareholders, the committee should establish stock ownership and holding requirements that require directors and senior management to acquire and hold a meaningful amount of the company's stock, at least for the duration of their tenure, and depending on the company's circumstances, perhaps for a certain period of time thereafter.
Why do you think? Why do you think this is suggested? Anyone?
If you mod for the most part, if you own shares and other assets of the company, in this case, they mentioned the stock ownership, then you are more likely to make the right decisions that would positively affect the company.
Why would you do that?
I mean, if you are a stock owner, I mean, it benefits you and by extension the company. The reverse can be seen if, in this case, a director or senior management, if they don't own a very limited amount of stocks, then they are more likely or easily convinced to, make certain decisions that, could have an adverse effect on the company. But when you own it, you um, it's a greater buy-in, in my
Indeed,
mind.
it's
And,
called
and
a it's
yeah,
called a vested interest.
yeah. In addition to that, Charles, um, the owning stock, you become a part owner of the company based on the ownership, the amount of stock that you're holding. Um, and it's not gonna be easy now for another company to come in and pinch you as a stock owner.
Yeah, because you're going to be a little more concerned, a little more vigilant,
Yeah.
and you're going to be checking on all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't normally check on
Mm,
if you're not a vested owner
yeah.
in that particular company. And
Yeah.
so this is why some companies insist that directors acquire a certain amount of stock, at least for the duration of their directorship, to keep them interested and quote unquote honest, so to speak, and even like they suggest for some period thereafter, if not forever. All right. So clearly, that's the point. When you go into the bank to buy a house, one of the first things they want to know is whether or not you have a down payment.
Right.
Because if your house is $300,000 and you have to come up with $60,000, you're not going to treat that mortgage too shabbily, generally speaking.
No.
Okay, because of the investment that you had to make in that mortgage. The same principle applies to the investment in company shares by directors.
Right.
All right. So yeah, keep going.
The company should have a policy that monitors, restricts, or even prohibits executive officers' ability to hedge the company's stock and requires ongoing disclosure of the material terms of hedging arrangements to the extent they are permitted.
What do we mean by hedging? Anyone?
That you own the stock, but you would like sell it on a different on a you own the stock, what you call it, directly from the company, but then you would sell it on the exchange.
Yeah, like you now using the company stock that's supposed to keep you honest to kind of like when we say hedge your bets, to trade and to try to profit and do some stuff that you shouldn't be doing with that stock. Maybe
Right.
saying I have some stock, I'll short it for the amount I have and start doing all kinds of weird stuff. As far as so the rules have to be clear that those kinds of things are discouraged or even in some cases prohibited, because you don't really want the director who buys shares to play around with the stock. You want him to keep them so that he or she can remain quote unquote honest and committed.
Yeah.
Is that equivalent to insider trading?
Not directly, but this kind of hedging could use inside information to do its work if directors are allowed to hedge the stock that they purchase in the company. That's why it's discouraged as well, because they're privy to information, and if they are allowed to trade the stock that they purchase in the company, then they can use that inside information to start playing around with the stock on the stock market for their own personal benefit. And that's not really the objective of acquiring company shares generally. Okay? All right, keep going.
Risk. The Compensation Committee should review the overall compensation structure and balance the need to create incentives that encourage growth and strong financial performance with the need to discourage excessive risk taking, both for senior management and for employees at all levels. Incentives should further the company's long-term strategic plans by looking beyond short-term market value changes to the overall goal of creating and enhancing enduring value. The committee should oversee the adoption of practices and policies to mitigate risk created by compensation programs, such as a compensation recoupment or clawback policy. Director compensation. The Compensation Committee may also be responsible, either alone or together with the Nominating/Corporate Governance Committee, for establishing director compensation program, practices, and policies.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles, for that insight in that very tricky part of the board operations, especially the issues that deal with succession and compensation. These are all always hot spots. I noticed that Commonwealth Bank a couple of weeks ago had their AGM online. It was a rather interesting thing because of COVID. There were only two directors sitting at the table, a little itsy bitsy table in the room somewhere, I guess COVID thing. And with their masks on, one was the chairman of the board and the other one was the CEO. And they pretty much ran through the agenda in about, I don't know, 17 seconds or something. Perhaps I'm just being a little facetious. But what I'm saying is, in practice, a lot of these things um, are not actually carried out the way they ought to be. Oftentimes they are, but all too often they're not. So it's and it's interesting thing about this governance thing, because for years now, I've been trying to encourage board members and senior management people to have somebody come in, like myself or somebody else, to have a half-day seminar, discussion, a reminder, whatever we want to call it, about what they ought to be doing and thinking about. But they're not keen on that because as board members and senior management people, as far as they're concerned, they know what?
Everything.
Of course. And therefore, why should we bring in Tingham and Tingham down to tell us any of this stuff? Because after all, we are already board members. We are already senior management people. So we know what we're doing. We don't need a half-day seminar, a full-day seminar to discuss what we ought to be doing. We know what we're doing. And they are very adamant and sometimes even facetious about it. When in fact, anybody who knows the truth about anything knows that what we ought to be doing is not always what we're doing. And it never hurts to remind ourselves of what we ought to be doing. But even the best of us hate to be reminded.
Yeah.
And so that's why problems continue to persist, even in households where you have the mother and father is the board of directors in the home, and then the children are like senior management and then the rest, and then God is a shareholder. Let's put it that way. Even in that environment, sometimes the board members are fighting with each other, like, I wanted my way, I wanted my way. Don't tell me I know better. I went to school, you dumb, I smart, you this, I make more, you make less. All kinds of weird fighting going on. And then the rest of the firm down the line, who are the children, like, what the hell? And just like all persons in an organization, like, what the hell? And then we don't want to like do stuff to fix it. It's the same kind of stuff going on. And so they don't have the, and when they do have these sessions where they go out to like be enlightened, it's a different kind of enlightenment. They don't want to be told the real hardcore stuff. They just want to like have a little light thing with a few martinis and caviar and then close the meeting quickly in an hour, and then be on their way to what they already know. So as they already know everything, and add to knowing everything, we don't want to be reminded about anything at all, strangely enough. And who are you to remind me? I'm the chairman of the board. You are, and who are you again? Kind of thing. Okay. So these are some of the realities that create major conflicts within firms. And so even though we can be better, we're oftentimes not as good as we can be because we think we have it all together and we think we know it all, and we definitely don't wish to be reminded about everything we know. Okay. All right. So having said that, we are now into this little discussion about the operation of the board. Interestingly enough, next week when we come together in our final lecture before your exam, our major focus will be on the central bank's requirements as far as corporate governance is concerned. And the reason why I isolated that for this particular class is because these guidelines that we're talking about this week and last week happen to be the general overall corporate governance guidelines for any and all types of entities, whether they're profit, non-profit, or whatever the case might be, private or public. Our discussion next week is going to look at corporate governance again, but from a central bank or regulator's perspective in terms of what the central bank and regulators in general, the general expectations about how boards should function. You'll see, if you haven't looked forward already, that many of the principles are the same as the general guidelines, obviously, But there are some unique things about the financial services side of things from a regulator's perspective that they have expectations about. And so for those of you who work for financial institutions and have worked for financial institutions, next week's session will add a little more, hopefully, to what you already have in your repertoire. And then certainly that added to these general guidelines about how governance should be operated no matter where you go. Hopefully at the end of the day, that kind of gives you that broad perspective so that whether you're employee, senior management, board member, shareholder, when you get out there in the jungle, you'll be able to fight with the animals a little more constructively. God forbid. All right, so the board operations then at this stage of the game, basically we've seen all the core issues of how the board should run and senior management should work and how shareholders feel and then how they want to be involved and who we want to be involved and who we don't want to be involved and how to compensate and how to know. And so now we're talking the board operations. Now board operations obviously will vary from organization to organization. And so how much time is spent at board meetings, how often we meet and all this kind of stuff will vary by company, by entity, by size, by type, by nature, by exigency, whatever the case might be. And so pretty much with regards to the general operations and the meeting times and that kind of thing, it's an open mind situation. You walk into an organization, you see what they're doing as a board member, senior management person. If the practice is appropriate in your opinion, you go with the flow. You don't need to rock the boat. If, however, it's not appropriate based on your experiences, you know that these kinds of meeting times and general operations should be subject to adjustments. Good luck trying to make adjustments. Some boards around the world are not interested in adjusting anything, no matter how many great reasons you give them. They're comfortable with that. It's like having the same pew at church. Like you go to church one Sunday and somebody's sitting in your seat. Anybody ever had that experience?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Or somebody's come in and they tap you on the shoulder and say, yeah, Marissa, or Ronaldo, I'm sorry, Sonny, but girly, but I'm afraid you are in my seat. And then you're thinking, because you're like 21st century person, like, well, there's an empty space over there. And like they're like, don't you get it? This is my seat. And some boards operate that way. And if you go into such an environment, unless you know how to maneuver in that environment, trying to make changes to the operation of the board, you might find yourself overboard. Which brings me to the next point, overboarding. We talked about overboarding. Try to stay away from overboarding. We know what the problems are with overboarding. Only overboard if you're capable and have the time and the resources and you're really on top of your game. And even then, too much of anything will kill you, including board work. But some people get so hyped up, like I'm on 7 boards. And they get all hyped up about being on 7 boards. They're not saying that they're not effective on 7 boards. They're not saying that 4 of them are about to kick them out or whatever, as long as they're still there making the money and whatever the case might be. Okay? So watch out for overboarding. These executive sessions, if you notice in our discussions on executive sessions, notice the opening salvo. Directors should have sufficient opportunity to meet in executive session outside the presence of the CEO and any other management directives. Now, folks, why would that be necessary? They don't trust them? Why should the board have executive time away from senior management and other management people?
Well,
why?
They may have to discuss issues with senior management and the CEO.
Yeah,
And
it's just about them.
yeah, they may be hesitant to have that conversation if the CEO is there, and the CEO, may
Or
have
any of his cohorts, the CEO, the CFO, the other O. Indeed. And so if the discussion is about them and their performance and all kinds of other things connected thereto directly or indirectly, they may have to meet separately. Furthermore, there may be some shareholder issues that they don't want for senior management to be involved in because of whatever reasons.
Right.
Okay.
It becomes now an ownership issue if it's the shareholder.
Indeed, and certain things about shareholders, the board may not want senior management to be tied up in, aware of, or connected thereto for any number of reasons. And those reasons will be determined on a case-by-case basis, by all means. Okay, so these executive sessions with senior management and his gang or her gang are excluded. It's not personal. It's just something that has to be done from time to time by the board so that the quote-unquote pure board members can make certain other decisions, have certain discussions. Remember, we have what we call pure board members, directors, and then we have executive directors. Executive directors are usually those persons who work for the firm. Non-executive directors are those persons who don't work for the firm. And clearly you can see why they must meet in separate sessions from time to time. Okay? Because oftentimes executive directors have agendas that are quite different from the non-executive directors, clearly, which is different oftentimes from the independent non-executive directors. So you can see it's a war zone sometimes. It shouldn't be a war zone. It should just be a zone everybody is well aware of their responsibilities and duties to the company and making those decisions that are in the best interest of the company. Unfortunately, human nature is not quite that way. Okay? Agendas are a tricky thing. We think that an agenda sometimes is just putting the process on a piece of paper, going to the board meeting and say, come, a meeting adjourned. Agendas are not necessarily that simple. Okay? Notice in the middle of the discussion, we are told that the board chair should work with the lead director, if there is one, in setting the agenda so that certain people can be on the same page. Because sometimes an agenda is set at the exclusion of certain people who should know certain things. And when the board meeting starts, the person says, excuse me, was not aware that that would be presented on the agenda today. I thought that would have been excluded completely. I was under the impression that we'll do that next week and so on. Okay? So an agenda is not simply pieces of paper with some stuff written on it about how the meeting will go. Agendas have caused many battles in board meetings for one reason or another. Okay? Confidentiality. Why should that even come up? Shouldn't that be a given? Well, it should be. But again, by nature, people are not necessarily confidential. We like to talk about stuff to people we shouldn't talk to them about. Certain things we could say, but we don't have to say people's names or circumstances. That's fine. If it's public knowledge, like it's in the court of law and that kind of thing, that's fine. But if somebody opens an account for $10 million, you shouldn't necessarily tell somebody who does not need to know that a particular named person and that sort of thing, unless they are the appropriate competent authorities, this sort of thing. So confidentiality at the board level is very important. Notice, confidentiality is not indicated as a right, it's a duty. Clearly, directors have a duty to maintain the confidentiality of all non-public information, whether or not it is material. Now, question, what do we mean by material? Anyone? That's a very popular word in accounting and auditing, materiality. But what do we mean by materiality? Anyone?
Are we talking about relevance?
Okay, getting warm.
So not relevant.
Yeah, relevance is part of materiality, but it's getting warm.
Significance. Materiality is yeah, like the significance, the
So we have relevance.
The importance of it.
Okay, so we have relevance, we have significance, and we have importance. All three of them are correct with regards to materiality. Now, the question is, what one person considers to be material may not be considered to be material by someone else. So for example, when an external auditor goes into a firm, the inside accounting department might make a statement that a particular entry or transaction, because of the amount or type of transaction it was not a material transaction, and therefore they didn't bother to disclose it. The auditors, on the other hand, might come in and say, wait a minute, the amount involved may not be a huge amount, but it is significant information that minority shareholders should be aware of because of their interest in the company. And so therefore, since minority shareholders might have an interest in that information, suddenly it cannot be perceived as being immaterial anymore. It becomes a material item. So yes, relevance, significance, and importance are all part of the definition of material. And so what we're saying here in terms of confidentiality, whether we think it's important or not, significant or not, or relevant or not, we should maintain the confidentiality of information unless we're required to disclose it by the competent authorities. Who are the competent authorities? The customer, him or herself, giving you written authorization. The bloody government regulators who have the authority to request it. And certainly, last but not least, the court of law, who will make you do it under contempt of court if you don't. Other than that, we have to keep the issue of confidentiality close to the forefront as we do independence. I'm not going to, I think we've kind of beaten director compensation to death. I still want you to read it, okay? Notice the opening sentence for director's compensation here under operations of directors. The amount and compensation and composition of the compensation paid to a company's non-employee directors should be carefully considered by the board with the oversight of the appropriate board committees. Question. Let me just take you out on a limb for a little bit. First of all, who are the non-employee directors? Who are they? Anyone? Who are they?
Your independent directors.
Yeah, those are persons who don't work for the firm. Remember, executive directors work for the firm. So if you're a CEO, you're the CEO of the company and you're also a director. That's what we often refer to as the managing director, because you're managing the firm and you're a director. Okay? So, those persons would be considered executive directors. The CFO, the head of legal, these persons who all work for the firm might also be directors for one reason or another, because the company thinks that's good for them to sit on the board. The rest of the persons are considered non-executive directors. Okay? So their compensation has to be considered separately. Why is it that we don't have to consider the compensation for executive directors, anyone?
Because they're already getting paid from the company.
Thank you, gracias. Fine, yes, they're already being paid by the company. They will not get a separate salary for being director.
Hi, sorry, can you repeat that question?
Why is it that executive directors are not paid by the board, by the company, for director services?
Okay, thanks.
Does the answer make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're already paid. They're $100,000 a year, $300,000 a year, millions a year, whatever it is. So they're certainly not going to be considered for additional money. The non-executive directors, on the other hand, they are going to sit before, based on your studies so far, what kind of committees might be involved in compensation discussions for directors, non-executive? Which committees potentially?
That would be the nomination /
committee or
corporate
The
governance.
auditing.
the audit committee, absolutely. Or the compensation committee. Okay, of course. The point is, I just wanted to drag you out on a limb a little bit so that you can see how this academic stuff can begin to be applied to real world situations, past and present. So when you see these things in the future, you say, wait a minute, that's not what I studied. That seems to be inconsistent. And now you have a dilemma of some kind. Because now you have to find if it's really consistent. If it is consistent, what are you going to do about it? What the consequences are for you if you try to do anything about it? Who are you going to get to help you do something about it? And so on. Are you going to form a coup and overthrow? Go to the shareholders privately and blow the whistle? See, a lot of things are going on that the rest of us don't see at that level. Okay? And these kinds of things are just designed to help you to understand what really ought to be happening at the board governance level. Okay? We talked about education at some length. I'm sure the additional information can be different from the appropriate education for board members. Why wouldn't we consider the appropriate education for executive directors? Should we?
Well, I mean, their professional history would have already been taken into consideration for them to be employed.
Indeed, unknown because they still work there, by all means. So by the time you get somebody to the executive committee, they are senior people who work for the company, so their education and experience and all that stuff are known, which means that the time should and would be spent on the non-executive directors, making sure that they have the appropriate qualifications, experience, and background to sit on a particular board. Okay? This word reliance has come up with regards to board members. In performing its oversight, the board is entitled under state and every other law, hopefully, in this part of the world anyway, to rely on the advice reports, etc., opinions of management, blah, 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 auditors and expert advisors. Board should be comfortable with the qualifications, blah, blah, blah. In other words, if you're sitting on a board, whoever's giving you advice, you need to be satisfied as a board member that they're qualified, competent, and experienced enough to be giving advice or be giving the board advice. If that is in question, then certainly it must be brought to question in terms of whether the board should continue to take advice from such individuals or groups or entities. Okay? And then, of course, the issue of board and committee evaluations is always a tricky process because evaluations at any level, in any organization, any type of entity, is always a tricky time. Performance appraisal. And how do you appraise performance at the board level? Who's going to be my next? I think we need to read this one so it can reverberate. Okay, who haven't read yet for the night? Volunteer. Somebody who's not yet read last week and tonight.
That's Laura, Mr. Wilkinson.
Laura, doggone it, where's Laura?
Mr. Wilkinson, I'm here. Where are we, sir? I just had to run outside. We had a situation in my neighborhood. Forgive me.
No problem.
Someone was robbed.
Someone was robbed?
Yeah, at gunpoint. So I'm good. I'm back.
I know, but is that a governance issue?
It might be in a minute.
No,
it's not.
No, it is a governance issue because if the person used some of these things we were talking about, like ethics and stuff like that, then they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
in other words, governance issues are not all in the boardroom, are they?
And it is the pizza lady.
Yes, they are in our neighborhoods.
Yes, sir.
Governance issues are in our bedrooms. See that? Bedroom, church. Everywhere, this bloody governance thing. Ever heard the expression, govern yourself accordingly? That's where it came from. Sorry, Laura.
That's the problem. That's fine.
All right, so we're down in the section that talks about board and committee evaluations. I think, do you see that?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay. Let it rip.
Board and committee evaluations. The board should have an effective mechanism for evaluating its performance on a continual basis. Meaningful board evaluation requires an assessment of the effectiveness of the full board, the operations of the board committees, and the contributions of individual directors on an annual basis. The results of these evaluations should be reported to the full board, and there should be follow-up on any issues and concerns that emerge from the evaluations. The board, under the leadership of the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee, should periodically consider what method or combination of methods will result in a meaningful assessment of the board and its committees. Common methods include written questionnaires, group discussions led by a designated director, employee, or outside facilitator, often with the aid of written questions, and individual interviews. Senior management development and succession planning.
So before you go on, Laura, let me just say that that little, well, not so little paragraph, but that paragraph on board evaluations, that is the church version, the nice clean version. That part of it where everything is great, if only we can do it exactly that way. If you haven't thought about it already, think about your own performance appraisal at some organization you work for that you didn't agree with, that some supervisor who didn't like you, or some manager who was trying to get rid of you, or whatever the case might be, or God forbid, somebody who's doing it the correct way. But let's say the negative side of things, they're not doing it the correct way. Oftentimes, these evaluations every year can be very contentious. Sometimes people give you a report to sign, you read it, you're like, really, is this me for real? I don't know this person. This does not apply to me, and you don't want to sign it. And they say, if you don't sign it, a bolt of lightning will strike you, or I will, or whatever the case might be. And so you feel pressured, and you may or may not sign something, you may or may not sign. And so it can get really tricky at all levels in the organization. So if you can sit down and close your eyes for a moment and try to determine, I wonder what this could be like at the board level. It perhaps could be just as tricky, but depending on if there's a herd mentality, it may not be tricky at all. They just all agree to pay themselves exorbitant amounts. Everybody gets it. Nobody's dissatisfied. So we all pay ourselves $1 million a year, and everybody say, all in favor, say aye. We say aye, move on. And if there's no independent director who will say, well, I don't say aye, this obviously is going to put a great burden on this company, okay, kind of thing. Who's going to be bold enough to do that at the board level when it comes to evaluation? Then there are going to be some people that say, Mary shouldn't get all of that because she's lazy, and Tom hardly attends board meetings. And so therefore, Mr. Chairman, I think we should move to pay them less, or indeed remove them from the board or something. And so so Mary says, how dare you? And I know your wife, we go to the same church, John. I got to talk to her, or whatever the case might be. Then all of a sudden it gets weird. So again, these evaluations may not necessarily be academic, just as it is in the real world at every single level in the organization. And so, yeah, what we're doing here is looking at the nice written required side of it, but what really happens in practice, most times you have to hear it from the horse's mouth, or you have to be in a particular board, on a particular board. Interestingly enough, I read an article not too long ago, which suggested this. A lot of firms, financial and otherwise, have great written documentation about their anti-money laundering, terrorism, sanctions, and all the other things they should be doing on paper. But regulators have made it known many, many times that oftentimes when they go into the organization, they look at their policies and procedures regarding all these things. They are well written by the most competent people, paid a lot of money to do it. But when they check the actual practice of what's really going on in the organization, they discover all too often that what is written is not what is being done. Oftentimes, they cannot get an appropriate explanation, which results in a second inspection soon afterwards, a fine, a warning, a threat, or whatever the regulator thinks is necessary. to get the written word to be congruent with the practices, or get the practices to be congruent with the written word. All of this is part of the evaluation process. Okay? Remember, when regulators walk into your organization, as far as they're concerned, who's ultimately responsible for whatever happens? Anybody knows? Ultimately.
The CEO and board of directors.
Not even the CEO,
Board
but
of
the CEO by
directors.
extension, but yeah, the board of directors. Whenever you talk to any regulator anywhere in the world, they might have a subsequent discussion about the CEO if the board brings it up, like it's the CEO's fault or some stuff like that. Then the regulator might say, perhaps, Mr. Chairman, it might be the CEO's fault. But as far as your regulatory responsibilities, the buck stops with the board. Period. That's it. All of that is part of the evaluation process. Okay, keep going.
Senior management, development, and succession planning. Succession planning. Planning for CEO and senior management development and succession in both ordinary and emergency scenarios is one of the board's most important functions. Some boards address succession planning primarily at the full board level, while others rely on a committee composed of independent directors, often the Compensation Committee or the Nominating or Corporate Governance Committee, to address this key area. The board, under the leadership of the responsible committee, if any, should identify the qualities and characteristics necessary for an effective CEO and monitor the development of potential internal candidates. The board or committee should engage in a dialogue with the CEO about the CEO's assessment of candidates for both the CEO and other senior management positions. And the board or committee should also discuss the CEO's succession planning outside the presence of the CEO. The full board should review the company's succession plan at least annually and periodically review the effectiveness of the succession planning process.
Very well. Let's take a pen because you just said a mouthful. First of all, let me ask anybody on this board whether or not you have been involved in any kind of board succession discussion whatsoever, or any kind of succession period discussion of anything. Anyone? No? This my first.
Yes, I've been involved in the succession planning.
Okay, can you tell us something about how that went without incriminating yourself or anybody else?
We go through a selection process and we determine who is best able to fit the role to succeed the person who's there. We look at the qualifications, and in terms of the succession planning, we have persons who you work together to say what information needs to be passed on to the other person, or what information needs to be shared.
Indeed. Were there any disagreements about who should succeed whom?
No disagreements.
Stop the madness. You mean that just went like clockwork?
It did. There were no disagreements, but like you had mentioned before, some things are good on paper, but we don't know how effective it would be should it be necessary for it to be in effect.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because I find that, I don't know if it's to impress the regulator who's asking or if it's simply to say that you have a succession plan on paper. But for me, if you have a succession plan and you've identified successors and you claim to be working together with them to ensure that in the event they have to fill your space, they can. If you're doing all of that, then upon somebody's termination or resignation, you go ahead and bring somebody from the outside to fill a position. I don't understand that. And I know that's what you see more than anything. So the succession plan says one thing, but then when somebody resigns or is terminated, you go bring in somebody else, as if that succession plan did not already have the identified successor.
Indeed, Maria, you have touched on a nerve. Most persons,
I mean, this is what you see in reality. You know what I mean? Like all these things.
Of course, that is what you see in reality most of the time. No question about it. And somebody has stepped up to actually speak it. That is what we see in reality. No matter how many discussions we have, no matter what we write down on paper, they may be there. No matter what we agree to in principle at some board meeting and wrote it down for the secretary to record and file appropriately in the best folder that we have with their name on succession planning on the front. In practice, whenever it's time to succeed, all too often, we don't follow that succession plan. Most of the times, nobody questions openly anyway, maybe quietly on the inside somewhere, but not openly, why it was not done. And all too often as well, regulators are still not pursuing that area with the kind of diligence, because basically if you show the typical regulator a plan and you have it written down and you've highlighted the persons who plan to take over in the event of blah, 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 they presume, okay, fine, theoretically that's what you're going to do. And if I'm not sure it's even possible for them to necessarily monitor to see if you follow through, and organizations know this as well, and blah, blah, blah. To the extent possible, of course, regulators who come in every year can raise the question, can you see the succession plan is positioned the same? Have you signed on the new one to say nothing has changed? If something has changed, what has changed? Oh, you have a new CEO. Is it the one that you designated last year in the report we saw? No, it's not. Then the regulator can say, oh, it isn't. How come? And then the chairman or somebody wants to try and give an explanation. And then an astute regulator would then say, okay, I suppose your reason for not going with the succession plan recommendation is perhaps appropriate. We would like for you to file a complete report on all the reasons why you did not select the person for your succession plan and why you selected the person otherwise. So in other words, you kind of, as a regulator, you could kind of influence some of that, not necessarily much of it, by taking those kinds of actions, perhaps. Right? Not much of that is necessarily happening yet. Our regulators have not gone that far into the succession planning side of things, but yes, in practice, we know that the person selected is all too often not the person in the plan. And until regulators start to put a little pressure, we probably won't see too many changes. Once upon a time, for example, compliance officers were oftentimes fired from their jobs for doing their jobs well. Managing directors and CEOs didn't like that compliance officers were being diligent in their work and oftentimes threatened and fired them. The hue and cry is still out there for the government to pass legislation to make it impossible for companies, or difficult for companies, to fire compliance officers who are doing their jobs, quote unquote. That's a governance thing of the future. But in the interim, something interesting was done by the Central Bank of the Bahamas a few years ago. They decided, okay, we don't have the legislation, but we have the policy position that we'll take, that if and when a compliance officer resigns or is fired from the company, not only does the company have to notify the Central Bank of the Bahamas of this fact, but it must also give the reason or reasons as to why it occurred. And I suspect whether or not that policy is working well in practice is another issue, but I suspect that policy was designed to try to interrupt some of this "we'll do whatever we want" thing to persons who seek to regulate or practice good governance. Okay? So, some food for thought as you rummage your way throughout this process. Okay, keep going, Laura.
Management development. The board and the independent committee, if any, with primary responsibility for oversight of a succession planning, also should know what the company is doing to develop talent beyond the senior management ranks. The board or committee should gain an understanding of the steps the CEO and other senior management are taking at more junior levels to develop the skills and experience important to the company's success and build a bench of future candidates for future management roles, for senior management roles. Directors should interact with up and coming members of management, both in board meetings and in less formal settings, so they have an opportunity to observe managers directly and begin developing relationships with them. CEO evaluation.
That's interesting. I wonder how many firms you see that happening. All right, keep going. The CEO evaluation now. Okay.
CEO evaluation. Under the oversight of an independent committee or the lead director, the board should annually review the performance of the CEO and participate with the CEO in the evaluation of members of senior management in certain circumstances. All non-management members of the board should have an opportunity to participate with the CEO in senior management evaluations if appropriate. The results of the CEO's evaluation should be promptly communicated to the CEO in executive session by representatives of the independent directors and used in determining the CEO's compensation.
My. I can assure you this kind of governance is easier said than done. To the extent that these things are done in the way they're done, is a whole different ball game. Okay? And perhaps some of you might have the good fortune one day to actually sit on a board and see whether or not, to what extent these governance requirements are actually being conducted in practice. Don't be surprised if you run into significant inconsistencies. Okay? All right, keep going.
Relationships with shareholders and other stakeholders. Corporations are often said to have obligations to stakeholders other than their shareholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, the communities, and the environments in which they do business, and government. In some circumstances, the interests of these stakeholders are considered in the context of achieving long-term value. Shareholders and investors. The shareholder outreach. Regular shareholder outreach and ongoing dialogue are critical to developing and maintaining effective investor relations. Understanding the views of shareholders and helping shareholders understand the plans and views of the board and management.
Now, before you go on, Laura, let me just say this. See the shareholder outreach? Now, companies that have millions of shareholders, we still don't have the excuse that there are too many shareholders to reach out to. No such thing. In the world of modern information transmission, we can reach out to God even. Okay, remember, by simple prayer. So we can reach out to God by simple prayer. Certainly we can reach any number of shareholders we want to reach if we want to. And the important thing about this is keeping shareholders informed about what's going on in the company. You might be surprised or not surprised to know that many CEOs and his or her gang are not interested particularly in keeping shareholders up to date. They want shareholders to be ignorant because certain things they're doing, they don't want shareholders to know. Which is why oftentimes when somebody blows the whistle or a shareholder finds out about something, they have to fire the whole board. Yeah, the whole bloody board because of major inconsistencies. Okay, and unfortunately, there are many senior management persons who continue to do this. They keep shareholders in the dark because they're running the company like it's their own little shop, their own baby that they brought into the world. Like they delivered it. And the shareholders are just incidental. And by golly, we know by now that under good governance and good ethics, that is surely not, and even by law, That is surely not the case. Okay? So this shareholder outreach thing is a very simple expression, but it has very, very deep implications. Okay? Implications to the extent that we as CEOs and senior management are told, hey, we need to know who our shareholders are. Where are they? They need to know what management is doing. Communicate with them. Tell them stuff. Don't hide important information like some accounting firms do and some accountants and organizations. They hide information in financial statements. They hide information in disclosures. They hide information by not bloody disclosing and so on. And if you don't know what to look for, and you need to be very experienced, very keen, very aware of things to be able to detect those kinds of hide and seek issues. But that's another issue, right? Okay, keep going, Laura.
Know who the company's shareholders are. The Nominating or Corporate Governance Committee and the board should know who the company's major shareholders are and understand their positions on significant issues relevant to the company.
Mm-hmm.
Role of management. Members of senior management are the principal spokespersons for the company and play an important role in shareholder engagement. This role includes serving as the main points of contact for shareholders on issues where management is in the best position to have a dialogue with shareholders.
Yes.
Board communication with shareholders. When appropriate, and in consultation with the CEO, directors should be equipped to play a part from time to time in the dialogue with shareholders on the topics involving the company's pursuit of long-term value creation and the company's governance. Communications with shareholders is subject to applicable regulations such as Regulation Fair Disclosure and company's policy on confidentiality and disclosure of information. These regulations and policies, however, should not impede shareholder engagement. Direct communication between directors and shareholders should be coordinated through and with the knowledge of the board chair, the lead independent director, and or the nominating corporate governance committee or its chair.
In other words, let's keep it open, guys and girls. Let's not run the company like it's some kind of KGB operation, of CIA thing, where you have all kinds of different players playing hide and seek, hiding information and ducking and dodging and lying. And let's not do that. This whole thing is about, let's be open, let's talk to each other. We're the three pillars of this entity, the shareholders who own it, the directors who run it and strategically, and the CEO and his or her cohorts who run the day-to-day affairs and execute. Let's do it properly. That's really what the governance discussion is about. And all these details are designed so that we do not trip up and break our necks in trying to execute these things. That's the point. And believe it or not, with all this great stuff out there, folks are still not doing a whole lot of things they ought to be doing. Okay? All right, keep going.
Annual meeting. Directors should be expected to attend the annual meeting of shareholders, absent unusual circumstances. Companies should consider ways to broaden shareholders' access to the annual meeting, including webcast, if requested by shareholders.
Now, why do you think you make it up? Why do we even have to put it in there like, oh, we should engage the shareholders? Because boards and senior management people oftentimes even collude to exclude shareholders, because oftentimes they don't want them to know what's going on or to hear or to be involved in the intimate aspects of the company. Only what they want to feed them by some communication when they feel like it, or some public statement if it's a public statement required by law or regulation. Keep going.
Shareholder engagement. Companies should engage with long-term shareholders in a manner consistent with respective roles of the board, management, and shareholders. Companies should maintain effective protocols for shareholder communications with directors and for directors to respond in a timely manner to issues and concerns that are of widespread interest to long-term shareholders. Board duties. Shareholders are not a uniform group, and their interests may be diverse. Although boards should consider the views of shareholders, the duty of boards is to act in what it believes to be long-term best interests of the company and all its shareholders.
Let me ask you a question before you go on, anyone. Shouldn't that be the expectation that they should act in the best interest of the firm? That should not even be the issue. That's really why boards exist, to act in the best interest of shareholders. Unfortunately, sometimes if you get to know boards intimately, you'll wonder if there are any shareholders in that company at all. All right, keep going.
Although boards should consider the views of shareholders, the duty of the board is to act in what it believes to be the long-term best interest of the company and all its shareholders. The views of certain shareholders are one important factor that the board evaluates in making decisions, but the board must exercise its own independent judgment once the board reaches a decision. The company should consider how best to communicate the board's decision to the shareholders. Shareholder voting. While some shareholders may use tools such as a third-party analysis and recommendations in making voting decisions, these tools should not be a substitute for individualized decision-making that considers the facts and circumstances of each company. Companies should conduct shareholder outreach efforts where appropriate to explain the basis for the board's recommendations on the matters that are submitted to a vote of shareholders.
Indeed.
Shareholder proposals. The federal proxy rules require public companies to include qualified shareholder proposals in their proxy statements. Shareholders should not use the shareholder proposal process as a platform to pursue social or political agendas that are largely unrelated or immaterial to the company's business, even if permitted by proxy rules. Further, a company's proxy statement is not always the best place to address even legitimate shareholder concerns.
Does everybody know what a proxy is? Usually, if you cannot appear at
someone who appears on your behalf.
Acts on your behalf.
Yeah, if you cannot appear as a shareholder at the meeting to vote for yourself, you may send somebody as a proxy to vote for you, or you may complete a proxy form and somebody at the meeting will vote on your behalf. All right, keep going.
Shareholders with concerns about particular issues should seek to engage in a dialogue with the company before submitting a shareholder proposal. If a shareholder submits a proposal, the company's board or its nominating or corporate governance committee should oversee the company's response. The board should consider issues raised by shareholder proposals that receive substantial support from other shareholders and should communicate its response to all shareholders.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that mouthful as well. The other bits of information, I'm sure you'll have no difficulty understanding when you read, that has to do with the role of employees and the social responsibility of the company. We've pretty much covered all the key stuff as far as the guidelines for good governance for any type of entity. And so when we get together next week, we will please make a note. We will be looking at CBOB, Central Bank of the Bahamas, guidelines for corporate governance of financial institutions, which is a more directed target in terms of governance issues for financial institutions. And so now you have the overall, and so now we're going to take the targeted approach next week for all types of financial institutions, including gaming, credit unions, or any other type of financial institutions that might be operating in the Bahamas. So And for next week, there's an introductory section to those guidelines. Feel free to read them if you feel crazy about it. But our lecture will begin on page 10, which talks about the opening of governance of financial institutions, page 10 of the notes. So you may want to wish to make a point of that if you don't get to the introductory reading before next class. All right, and then further on in that discussion, we'll be talking about certain key risks, special committees, and then finally the annual certification that the Central Bank of the Bahamas requires of financial institutions in order to keep track and keep an eye on the governance process for financial institutions in particular. Any questions before I say the last thing for this evening? Oh, okay.
No.
Let me just, I want to share a screen here. If I can, let me see if I can pull this off. Share screen, doggone it, it worked. Okay, I think. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Can see it.
now what I need you to do is to get a piece of paper. I know this is a very rare request, doggone it. But if any piece of paper, grab something with a pen that's and something you can write on, because I am going to go through a couple of principles of good governance that I want you to jot down in your own handwriting. And let me just say for the record that this will be one of your examination questions. And the reason why I'm putting it that way and making a big deal of it is because these few principles, along with everything else that we have done and will be doing, is pretty foundational, something you want to carry around in your head, if possible. So I want to make a little bit of a fuss about it by having you make a note of it personally. Okay? So, are we ready?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. If I click on it too or I move too quickly and you don't get blah blah blah, just say hold it, and then I'll hold it. Okay, here we go. So these are the principles of corporate governance. These are foundational. They incorporate much of everything we've discussed. Remember, and these principles represents the macro foundational governance issues that oftentimes arise in any type of organization. And all that other great stuff we've done so far from the beginning is really the micro side of this macro foundation. All right, principles of corporate governance. Pretty dramatic music for some reason. But anyway, guess that's designed to let us know that it's a very grave and important issue. I don't know. Very interesting music. So number one, consider the integrity and ethical behavior of your organization, any organization. Consider the integrity or honesty and ethical behavior of that organization. Okay? And we are told that this can be achieved by developing a code of conduct. See? Developing means sitting down, talking about it, and writing it down for both executives and directives. Okay? Principle number one, develop a code of conduct for the directors and executives. Why do we develop a code? For example, I'm a member of this entity called Step International. Anybody ever heard about that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's trust in the states. Uh, and like any other professional entity, like the ACCA, the CA, CFA, whatever these groups are, these professional entities have this code of conduct. It's written down. Every member has to read it. Every year when you renew your membership, you have to read it and sign off and say you've read it. The reason for that is the professional entity does not want any of its members who are practicing professionals to behave in a manner that is unacceptable for the organization reputation. So we have to read it every year, sign it every year before we can actually get our membership, even though we're the ones paying for the bloody membership. That's how seriously professional entities take this book. Why should we do it at the board level? So that both directors and executives and shareholders, all the principal players can know in advance what is expected. The idea is to put everybody on the same page so that if somebody steps out of line, everybody knows that they stepped out of line. And the question will be, what are we going to do about it? Especially during that evaluation of board members process, remember? And that succession planning process, and who's going to be the next CEO process and all that stuff. Okay? Very important that it is actually articulated and then written down. Principle number 2, disclosure and transparency. Once again, the information, the strategy, and the processes and procedures for verifying the integrity of the company's financial statements should be written down. It should be open and available to everyone. It should be no secret. And anybody who doesn't want to answer questions or show the relevant documentation, that is a governance problem. That is why when regulators walk in, they ask you to
You went quiet, just Mr. Wilkinson.
Can't hear you.
No, can't hear him.
Me either.
Same as if your mic muted.
I think we lost him again.
He's there because he's fiddling with his screen.
Yeah, his mouse is moving, so he's there.
Check the mute button. So
We still can't hear you.
Okay, guys. He's saying that he's on audio somewhere. We'll pick up principles next week. Have a great week. Tell everyone good night for him. He's waving. So good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh, good night.
Night.
Good night. Good night.
You want more fish?